Picture this. It is a regular Tuesday night in 1964. Millions of Americans are settled into their living room chairs, the glow of the television flickering across their faces. The Twilight Zone is on, and for 30 minutes, they are about to take a trip into the unknown. But on this particular night, something goes terribly wrong. The episode ends. The credits roll. And by the very next morning, the phones at CBS are ringing off the hook. Letters are flooding in. Advocacy groups are furious. And network executives, the same men who had given Rod Serling permission to air this episode, are now scrambling to make it disappear as fast as humanly possible. Within days, the episode is gone. Not just pulled from the schedule. Gone. Wiped from reruns. Banned from syndication. Scrubbed from every marathon, every holiday special, every late-night repeat. For over 50 years, this one chapter of one of the greatest television shows ever made was treated like it simply did not exist. No announcements. No explanations. Just silence. And here is the part that should really make you lean forward in your seat. The episode was not banned because it was too violent. It was not banned because of anything supernatural or frightening. The thing that made this episode so dangerous, the thing that got it buried for half a century, was a story about two real human beings sitting in a room and simply talking to each other. Just talking. And somehow, that conversation was enough to bring one of America's most powerful television networks completely to its knees. So what happened inside that room? What was said between those two men that scared CBS so badly that they locked this episode away for 52 years? Stay with us, because this story goes much deeper than you might expect. To truly understand why this episode caused such a massive explosion, you have to understand the world it was born into. The Twilight Zone first appeared on American television screens on October 2nd, 1959. It was unlike anything that had ever aired before. Every single week, it told a completely brand new story. Different characters, different settings, different worlds. One week you might be watching a man trapped alone in a ghost town with no one else around. The next week you could find yourself watching an astronaut slowly losing his grip on reality deep in outer space. You never knew what was coming, and that was exactly the point. The show kept you guessing, kept you unsettled, and kept you coming back every single week for more. The man behind all of it was Rod Serling. And if you only know Serling as the calm, mysterious voice that opened each episode, standing there in that dark suit with a cigarette between his fingers, then you only know half the story. Because long before he became the guide through the fifth dimension, Rod Serling was a fighter. A man who had been in the trenches, both literally and figuratively, and had come out the other side with something important to say, and almost nobody willing to let him say it. Serling was born on Christmas Day, 1924, in Syracuse, New York. He grew up in a quiet small town where life moved at an easy and predictable pace. But when he was old enough to serve in World War II, he signed up without any hesitation. He wanted to fight in Europe against the Nazis. Instead, the Army sent him to the Pacific, where he served as a paratrooper and witnessed some of the most brutal and horrifying combat of the entire war. He earned a Purple Heart. He came home carrying wounds that went far beyond anything any doctor could see or treat. The things Rod Serling witnessed during that war never truly left him. They stayed with him every day and showed up later in every ghost, every monster, and every tortured soul he ever put on screen. When he came back home, he found that his father had died suddenly of a heart attack while he was away overseas. The double weight of wartime horror and personal grief would have broken most men completely. For Serling, it became fuel. He went to college in Ohio, met the woman who would become his wife, started a family, and threw himself entirely into writing. He worked 12-hour days, 7 days a week, chasing something that most television writers of that era were simply never allowed to chase. The plain and honest truth about what human beings are really capable of doing to one another. And that was the problem. In the late 1950s, television was not built for the truth. It was built for sponsors. The companies that paid for airtime had enormous power over what audiences could see and hear. If a tobacco company sponsored a show, characters could not be shown getting sick. If a car company was paying the bills, you could not show a competitor's vehicle anywhere in the background. For a serious writer like Serling, who wanted to explore racial injustice and the deep wounds of war and the darkness hiding inside perfectly ordinary people, this was an impossible and deeply maddening situation. The breaking point came when Serling tried to write a television drama about a real tragedy that had shaken the entire country. In 1955, a 14-year-old black boy named Emmett Till was brutally murdered in Mississippi. The case horrified America, and Serling felt it was exactly the story that television needed to tell. But every time he tried, the networks and sponsors shut him down completely. They changed the setting, changed the characters, softened the message until absolutely nothing of the original truth remained. He described watching his work get stripped of every ounce of meaning it had started with. That is, when he had his breakthrough idea. If he could not tell the truth directly, he would hide it in plain sight. He figured out that the censors simply did not care about prejudice happening on a distant planet or injustice unfolding in a world that did not exist. So he started building exactly that kind of world. A world where the real monsters wore ordinary human faces, and the real lessons about society lived just beneath the surface of every supernatural story he told. The Twilight Zone was born from that frustration and from that genius. And for 5 seasons, it worked. Serling found a way to smuggle some of the most powerful social commentary on American television right past the people who would have stopped him. He wrote about race and war and conformity and fear, all dressed up in science fiction clothing that made executives feel safe enough to let it through. Critics loved it. Audiences were completely mesmerized. The show became a cultural landmark almost immediately. But not every episode made it through cleanly. And one episode, more than any other in the entire 5-season run, crossed a line so severe that it triggered something nobody at CBS was remotely prepared for. The episode was called The Encounter. It aired during the show's 5th and final season in 1964. On the surface, it looked like another one of the show's tense psychological dramas. 2 men, one small confined space, a slow-burning confrontation that gradually strips away every polite pretense until the raw, ugly truth sits right there between them with nowhere left to hide. The setup was deceptively simple. A white World War II veteran named Fenton, played by actor Neville Brand, is up in his attic cleaning things out when a young Japanese-American man named Arthur Takamori, played by a rising actor named George Takei, shows up looking for yard work. Fenton needs help. Arthur needs the money. They are both reasonable men. They should easily be able to get through one ordinary afternoon together without incident. They cannot. Sitting in that dusty attic, buried among the clutter of Fenton's past, is a samurai sword. Fenton took it from a Japanese soldier he killed during the war and kept it as a grim reminder of something he survived. But from the very moment Arthur lays eyes on that sword, something shifts in the air between the 2 men. The conversation gets stranger and heavier, and slowly, almost without either man realizing what is happening, their darkest memories and most buried hatreds begin rising to the surface like something that has been held underwater for a very long time. The supernatural element in this episode is the sword itself. The story implies it carries a kind of cursed energy, a malice that tears down every wall both men have built around their worst selves. Under its growing influence, Fenton begins saying things he has never said out loud before, things about the war, about Japanese people, about the darkest corners of his own heart. And Arthur, rather than backing away, matches him. He begins confessing dark and troubling things too. Things that, in the context of a story, are meant to show how the trauma of war leaves no one completely untouched or clean. And that is precisely where the episode went too far and sealed its own fate. The script, written by Martin M. Goldsmith rather than Serling himself, included one specific plot point that would prove catastrophic. The story suggests that Arthur's father had been a traitor during the war. Not just any traitor, but a man who had helped enable the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. A Japanese-American man living in the United States, working secretly against his own country from within. When this aired on national television, the reaction from the Japanese-American community was swift, fierce, and completely understandable. Organizations across the country spoke out immediately and loudly, because what they saw on screen was not a careful exploration of wartime trauma and shared guilt. What they saw was a program watched by millions of Americans, suggesting that a Japanese-American man carried treasonous blood in his family. That betrayal of America was somehow woven into his inheritance. The people watching that episode knew exactly what those words meant, because they had lived the consequences of exactly that kind of thinking. During World War II, over 100,000 Japanese Americans had been forcibly removed from their homes by the United States government and sent to internment camps scattered across the country. They lost their houses, their farms, their businesses, and their freedom, all of it taken away based entirely on their ethnicity and the fear and racism of that moment. Families were uprooted overnight and placed behind barbed wire in the American desert. Many of them had sons and brothers and fathers who, even while their own families sat locked in those camps, chose to serve in the United States military to prove their loyalty to a country that was treating them as enemies. After the war ended, the Japanese-American community spent nearly 2 decades rebuilding everything they had lost and working to reclaim the dignity that had been stripped from them. And now, in 1964, here was a nationally watched television program suggesting that a Japanese-American father had been a traitor. That Pearl Harbor had an inside man with a Japanese-American face. The timing made everything worse. America was sliding deeper into involvement in Vietnam. Questions about race and national loyalty were already burning through the public conversation. An episode like this, broadcast into millions of homes, was not just offensive. In that specific moment, it felt genuinely dangerous to a community that had already paid a devastating price for exactly this kind of thinking. CBS pulled the episode immediately and without ceremony. There was no formal announcement, no press statement, no public explanation of any kind. The episode simply vanished. It was quietly removed from syndication packages sold to local stations. It was left out of every rerun schedule and every holiday marathon. When the series was packaged for repeat broadcasts in the years and decades that followed, the encounter was never part of the package. It became the one story in the entire Twilight Zone catalog that television refused to tell again. George Takei, who went on to become beloved worldwide as Hikaru Sulu on Star Trek, later talked about the episode with a careful and dry sense of humor. He noted that it held a very particular and uncomfortable distinction in his career. It was the only episode he ever appeared in that never received a single rerun during his entire professional life, which meant, he said with a quiet smile, that for over 50 years he never saw a single residual check from it. That is the kind of joke a person makes when the full truth of the situation is simply too complicated for an easy answer. Because there is something genuinely sad about the encounter when you look at it honestly. The episode was not made with hatred behind it. George Takei himself, a Japanese-American man who had personally experienced the internment camps as a child, read the script and agreed to appear in it. He believed at the time that the story was genuinely trying to say something meaningful about how war damages everyone it touches and leaves no soul completely clean. He saw the theme as being about shared guilt, about the invisible weight that both sides of any war carry long after the fighting stops. But good intentions do not erase real harm. The harm this episode caused, with this specific plot point, at this specific moment in American history, fell on a community that had already been through more than enough. The gap between what the writers meant to say and what the Japanese-American community actually heard was simply too wide to close with intentions alone. It was not until January 1, 2016, that the encounter finally and quietly resurfaced. More than 52 years after it was pulled from the airwaves, a New Year's Day Twilight Zone marathon on a cable network included it in the lineup without any special announcement or ceremony. It simply appeared among the other episodes and let the audience decide what to make of it with fresh eyes and a different world behind them. Watching it today, you can hold both things in your head at the same time. You can see what Martin M. Goldsmith was reaching for as a writer, and you can see just as clearly exactly where and why it goes wrong. You can understand what made George Takei want to be part of this story, and you can equally understand why the Japanese-American community found it deeply and justifiably offensive. The episode exists in that uncomfortable space that the Twilight Zone was always drawn to, that gray and uneasy territory between what a story intends and what it actually does to the real people it touches. In a strange and completely unintentional way, The Encounter may be one of the most honest episodes the show ever produced, though not in any way its creators planned or would have wanted. It is honest about how even the most well-meaning creative work can cause genuine and lasting damage to real communities. It is honest about how historical wounds do not simply close because enough years have passed over them. It is honest about the real limits of using fiction to deliver social commentary, because sometimes the message you are trying to send gets completely tangled up in the very prejudices you set out to expose and challenge. Rod Serling spent his entire career fighting against censorship and against the forces that wanted to keep American television comfortable and safe and without any real consequence. He found brilliant workarounds and creative disguises that let him slip real truths past the people who would have stopped him. But The Encounter stands as an important reminder that not every battle is fought against outside forces. Sometimes the most important limits are the ones a storyteller must place on himself. Sometimes the most responsible thing a writer can do is look at his own work and ask not just whether it is dramatically powerful, but whether it is fair to the real people it is talking about. Whether it takes genuine care of the communities whose stories it is borrowing. The Twilight Zone gave America over 100 episodes of genuine and lasting brilliance. It launched the early careers of some of the greatest actors Hollywood ever produced. It changed permanently what people believed television could accomplish and who it could give a voice to. Rod Serling's legacy is enormous and completely deserved. But The Encounter sits inside that legacy like a splinter that was never fully removed. A quiet and important reminder that even the most gifted and most morally serious storytellers work in a world where real people are shaped and sometimes hurt by the stories told about them. Where history is not just a dramatic backdrop, but a living wound that demands real respect. Where the responsibility of putting voices on screen goes far beyond entertainment, beyond artistic ambition, and even beyond the very best of intentions. For 52 years, CBS kept this episode hidden. Whether that was ultimately the right decision is something historians and viewers still debate today. What is not debatable is what the episode reveals about the America it came from, and about conversations this country is honestly still working through right now. The Twilight Zone always told us that the most frightening things in life were not the monsters, or the aliens, or the supernatural twists waiting around the next corner. The most frightening things were always the ones we refused to look at directly. The ones we kept locked safely in the dark, where we would never have to face them. For 52 years, The Encounter was exactly that. Something kept carefully out of sight, because looking at it directly felt too uncomfortable, too heavy, too loaded with the weight of real American history. Now that it is finally back in the light where anyone can see it, the question it leaves behind is one that Rod Serling himself would have recognized immediately, and probably would have written a very powerful episode about. What does it say about who we are that it took 52 years just to be willing to have the conversation this episode was imperfectly but genuinely trying to start? That is the question worth sitting with long after the screen goes dark. Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. We read every single one, and a story like this one deserves a real and honest conversation. If this video gave you something to think about, please give it a like and share it with someone who loves the deep history behind classic television. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss another story like this one. The next video is already waiting on your screen right now. We will see you there.